Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to this webinar about understanding the new 16 to 19 landscape in Professional Development Week. If I could ask, while we do this, if people could just have their microphones turned off, unless we want to spend the rest of the webinar with my dog barking, which is the most likely outcome. My name is Dave Rowley. I'm our product manager for technical education, and part of my, or the majority of my role for the last few years with NCFE has been kind of digesting all of the policy relating to the post-16 reforms and kind of translating that into understanding what the 16 to 19 qualification landscape is going to look like. Now, I'm very aware of the fact that we're hosting this webinar a day before the general election. And of course, there's a chance that there could be a change in government or a change in policy. But something important to keep in mind before we kind of go on to this is that there is a little bit of uncertainty, I suppose, about whether or not a new government might change some of the defunding that's going on in this August. But it's probably unlikely that any of the broader details that we discussed today are going to be changed in the short term. The reforms are happening over a long period of time and already we're quite a long way into them. So the likelihood that any of the stuff I'm going to tell you today is wrong or is going to disappear is probably unlikely at this stage. So what I want to do today, the real aim is to sort of think about, what if we look far into the future, once the reforms have concluded, what will the landscape look like? What will the qualifications remaining actually be? And then to layer on top of that, what have NCFE's kind of key considerations been? Like, what are we developing and why are we developing it? And how will that affect our key sectors? So without further ado, I shall kind of crack on with that. And I suppose the first thing to note is that, well, what do I mean by our key 16 to 19 sectors? So when we think about what NCFE does at 16 to 19, there really are 5 sectors in which we are kind of major players. Now, it's debatable whether some of those are actually like multiple sectors rolled up into one, but I think health and social care and education in early years, those traditional cash sectors, and then aviation, travel and tourism, sport and uniform public services are the kind of 3 areas we work in that are not cash, that are also kind of a considerable area for us. So our main priority when we went into the reforms was, how do we take those 5 sectors and ensure that there is continuity of provision in all those sectors? We want to make absolutely sure that there are no gaps, that we're not leaving things behind, and that everybody has something to teach in the future. Something you will also probably notice there is that a lot of the, as you're probably aware, a lot of the kind of media has been around T-levels, but if you look at those sectors there, really only 2 of those have a T-level in them. And the health and social care sector, the T-level really only covers half of that sector. So of those 5 sectors, only 1.5 is really covered by T-levels. So we need to understand, what can we develop through the reforms that will fill the gaps that T-levels don't fill? Because if you're a teacher of uniform public services, for example, there's not going to be a T-level in uniform public services. The question is, what are you going to have in the future? So attempting to summarize the landscape in one diagram is quite tricky, but I have attempted to do it. So this is my lovely clip art diagram of what the entire future holds, and there's a lot to digest here. So let's kind of break this down slowly. So the first thing to note is, you can see what I've done there is defined post-16 qualifications from level 2 upwards into higher education. And the first thing to note really is that the government is very keen to distinguish between academic education and technical education. Now you can see within technical education, that's the green stuff on the right hand side, I've also rolled apprenticeships in there. Now apprenticeships are not part of the reforms at all. They sit separately, they're not affected by it. So really you could think of it as academic qualifications, technical qualifications, and apprenticeships as kind of those 3 prongs. But if we were to think about what's the defining characteristic of an academic program, the primary purpose of that program is to progress learners onto the next level of education. So you can see all those purple qualifications, the arrow points upwards to the next level. And I stress that's the primary purpose. It's not the only purpose and not the only outcome that a learner could have. There's no reason why a learner couldn't do, for example, A levels and then get a job. That's perfectly acceptable. Similarly, you'll see on the technical side of things, a technical program is defined as having a primary purpose where the outcome is that a learner should go into skilled employment or further technical training. Again, represented by that arrow, which is pointing out to that thing on the right saying jobs. Again, very important to remember that that is not the only purpose. A learner can do a T-level or an apprenticeship or any of those programs, and of course they can step up to a level higher. There's no reason why a T-level learner shouldn't be looking at going on to a bachelor's degree as well. So those arrows really just represent the primary purpose, but they're a little bit misleading when we actually think about the outcomes that students see. In actuality, what they actually mean is it kind of shows us how we build that type of qualification. All the purple stuff on the left, the academic stuff, is very knowledge rich, and all of the green stuff on the right, the technical stuff, is knowledge, skills, and behaviors focused. So a little bit more kind of even-handed across all of those three areas. Now, many of these things people will have heard of before. I think everyone will know what an apprenticeship is, everyone knows what a degree is, everyone knows what A-levels are, and so on. But what should really be standing out to people as kind of new things they may not have seen before are AAQs, that's at level 3 there on the academic side, PROGs, or which is a shorthand for progression qualifications down here at level 2, that's a new thing. And finally, TOQs, TOQs, that's technical occupational qualifications. They exist at all levels, and again, are not something that previously existed. So if we're going to understand what the landscape holds for 16 to 19-year-olds, then we have to understand what an AAQ is, what a TOQ is, and what a PROG is. And then we can sort of fill in the rest of the gaps ourselves. So predefining what those things are is very, very important. So starting with level 3, if we kind of cut away all the fluff, so all the all the apprenticeships and the HTQs and so on, and we just look at level 3, this is really what we've got in the new landscape. And that quote there is from the DFE's documentation. They do want T levels and A levels to become the showpiece qualifications, if you like. But it's important to note that there are alternatives to both of those. A levels are academic qualifications, but there will be alternative academic qualifications, AAQs, and T levels are technical qualifications, and there will also be alternative technical qualifications. You would think they would name them ATQs, but unfortunately they didn't do that. They are technical occupational qualifications. So if you are a teacher in a sector that does not have a T level or an A level, and you're wondering what you're going to be teaching, the likelihood is you'll be teaching either an AAQ or a TOQ. But what is crucial is understanding the difference between the two, because my probably largest criticism of the way the reforms have been portrayed in the media is that AAQs have been getting a lot of airtime and have been kind of sold as the alternative to everything. And that's not true. They have a very specific place in the landscape, but we've got to remember TOQs as well. And if I'm honest, I would think the majority of general FE colleges should be looking very strongly in the TOQs, and schools and sixth form colleges should be looking very strongly at AAQs. And I'll elaborate as to why that is now. AAQs, what are they? So they're not really brand new things. As you can see, the definition there is that they have 40% external assessment by exam and 60% mandatory content. So essentially they're the same as applied generals are now. The difference really is that there are two different sizes we can make. We can make small ones. That means they're 360 GLH, the size of one A level. And they have to be taken in a program, a mixed program with A levels. You cannot take that as a standalone qualification. So these are brilliant, these small AAQs, for mixing in with A levels, particularly for schools who run a large A level contingent who will want to kind of add a vocational flavour to that. But they are not a full-time 1 year program or anything. They are 2 A levels, 1 AAQ, mixed program over 2 years. And then in a very, very small number of cases, awarding bodies are allowed to make a large AAQ. That means bigger than 720 GLH, 2 A levels or 3 A levels. And there's only 3 subjects that they can exist in: performing arts, sport, and creative arts. Now, that's because those subjects are deemed as being academic, i.e., they lead to bachelor's degrees. That's the most kind of standard output of those. But there's no combination of A levels that works for those subjects. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, but that's the three they've gone with. So, again, if you're a travel and tourism teacher or a uniform public services teacher, these large AAQs aren't going to fix your problems, nor will they do in some aspects of sport as well. That sport we're referring to as academic is sport and exercise science. Doesn't help us with sports coaching. So AAQs very clearly, very kind of constrained, kind of clear qualifications that are very clearly linked to A levels. And as I said, in most subjects, they don't really represent a kind of alternative to T levels or anything like that. They are a very important part of the landscape, I would say, for schools and sixth forms, less so for colleges. So what's a TOC? Well, a TOC, a technical occupational qualification, all they have to do is they have to align to some of the knowledge, skills, and behaviours in the occupational standards, and they're the same occupational standards on which apprenticeships are built. We're not constrained by having to reproduce them in the same way apprenticeships do. So an apprenticeship is just one occupational standard covered fully. In this area, we're allowed to sort of be a little more selective about how we pick our knowledge, skills, and behaviours. We can do it like kind of almost sector-wide, if that makes sense. And one of the things which make them interesting to AOs, certainly interesting to us, is that there's no rules about how big they've got to be. So the GLH can be big or small. They don't have to have exams in them. They don't have to have industry placements in them, which removes a lot of the, I suppose, scaling constraints that you see with things like T levels. Now, industry placements can be in them if it's an appropriate subject area. So social care would be a good example of something where a placement might be a good thing to have in it. But also if it's a subject that's not a good idea to have a placement in, I'm thinking of something like uniform services, where it's very difficult to get placements for learners in the protective services, in the army, and so on. So if it's not appropriate, we don't have to put it in. And if we don't want to put exams in, we don't have to. So there's a lot of flexibility to kind of play around with those things and make them kind of what the market needs. So to kind of summarize the difference between the two, you can see the primary purpose is defined there, but I don't think we want to worry too much about that primary purpose. The reason for that is that if you think about TOCs particularly as being about skilled employment, you start to worry yourself about things like UCAS points. And AAQs and TOCs will all hold UCAS points in the same way that level 3 qualifications do now. It's not really a thing we've got to worry ourselves about. More interesting is the idea of the content. So we've got knowledge rich versus knowledge, skills, and behaviors. The kind of size being very predetermined for AAQs, but not so much for TOCs. And from an NCFE perspective, AAQs will have this external exam content, whereas our TOCs will not. They will be internally assessed. So you can see if you think about something like travel and tourism and think, well, what would be the best replacement for the current qualification? You can kind of see that a TOC is the way to go, not an AAQ. Whereas if you were teaching an applied general certificate, an AAQ probably is the best replacement for that. Now, if you actually were to look at every different combination that a 16 to 19 learner could do, and this is every possible combination, you would look at this diagram. Now, some of those are very, very unlikely. So, for example, an AAQ the size of 2 A levels and 1 extra A level, I think would be very, very rare. Similarly, mixing technical and academic qualifications together at the bottom here, whilst possible, I think is very, very unlikely. So let's look at what the realistic options are. This is what the realistic options are going to be for 16 to 19-year-olds in education. They're going to do an academic program of A levels or A levels with an AAQ as well. In those 3 subjects I mentioned, there might be a large 3 A level AAQ. And then on the technical side of things, they can do a T level, an apprenticeship, or a very large TOC. And I suppose an important thing to remember is that there are only 11 T levels. So there will be a considerable number of TOCs to fill those gaps. There's 223 occupational standards at level 3. And given that there's only 11 T levels, that gives us a lot of room to build things that are not T levels. to kind of augment the technical landscape and really fill it out. So what are we going to submit? Now, I said there, what have NCFE submitted? Some of that stuff has not been submitted because the general election put a pause on the submission date. It was supposed to be last Friday, but it's been delayed until after the election. So again, let's break down what we're trying to do in our key sectors here. As you can see, the academic side of things is not something we're doing a massive amount of work in. We already have small qualifications in health and social care and education in early years, and so we're going to turn those into small AAQs. Again, should be extremely important for augmenting the A-level offer in schools and sixth forms. Similarly, if you look at sport is an interesting one because sport and exercise science is defined as being an academic subject, whereas sports coaching down here is a technical subject. You can see we've gone for an extended diploma in both of those things. And if you then look down the technical column, you will see in all of our key sectors, we are ensuring that there is a 3 A-level sized technical qualification available for learners. So our intention, where there is no T-level, is to make sure that we've got extended diploma provision, getting big UCAS points and kind of filling the gaps that they used to be filled with. So we've got social care as a nice parallel offering to our health T-level. Obviously, education in early years speaks for itself. Of course, we've got travel and aviation as 2 separate subjects now, sports coaching and uniform public services. Again, will they look wildly different to what's gone before? No, that's not the intention at all. We want to keep things looking roughly the same. The thing which is, I suppose, interesting is the timelines, because these timelines are subject to a little bit of change, shall I say. Now, if we ignoring health and social care and education in early years, if we look at the funding for new starts, it's an easy one to point out that the bottom 3 subjects, uniform services, sport and travel and tourism, all of the old provision, if the timelines stay the same, are still funded for 2 more academic years after this one, so 24-25 and 25-26. And then from the academic year 26-27, that's September 2026, all of these new qualifications, these new TOCs will go live and they'll replace the old ones. So there's nothing too dramatic happening in those sectors, really. We've got old provision being replaced by new provision, not too much to stress about there. What is more interesting, I suppose, is what's going on in health and social care and education in early years. Now, education in early years is a more straightforward one to explain because, of course, childcare and supporting teaching and learning, we know that for 16 to 19, that loses funding this August, and then the T-level will be the primary option for 16 to 19 learners. Similarly, in health and social care, we know that health and social care is being defunded at the same time. One of the issues we have, of course, is that the social care replacement doesn't go live until 2025 at the earliest, and it could potentially be 2026. So what that has left in health and social care is a bit of a gap in social care, and I think people are very aware of that. So, as I mentioned earlier, the general election, it's important not to get bogged down in, is this going to destroy the reforms? Is it going to be gone? There's no point speculating about that. We can assume that this is probably going to happen as expected. The only thing that could potentially change if a new government comes in is that the health and social care bar here and the childcare and STL bars might be extended by an extra year, thus filling in that black gap and ensuring that we've got continuity of provision. So fingers crossed that does happen, but of course we're not going to speculate about that now. We don't necessarily know what's going to happen, but that's the funding situation as it stands at the minute. Again, we will know more in mid-July as to whether that's changing, but ultimately, I don't suspect anything else will massively change in the meantime.
David.
Yes, Shine.
You took a little pause and there's a question come through, so I thought it was an opportune moment. Why is no consideration being given to a larger AAQ in education and early years as an alternative to the T-level to offer 16 to 19-year-olds an alternative route and more choice?
So in terms of, I'll go back to the that slide there. So yeah, so if we think about the education early years T-level, the alternatives to T-levels could be AAQs or TOCs. Now, I think the AAQ is a bit of a kind of a misleading one, because you would never expect an AAQ in education in early years or health and social care or any of these subjects, because they're specifically aimed at things that are very tied into A levels. The question, I suppose, would be, why can't we make a big TOC in education in early years? Now, the problem with that is that we are not allowed to make a TOC, a technical qualification, that maps to anything that's covered by a T-level. So we can't do, for example, an alternative health qualification, whereas we can do an alternative social care qualification, because they're two different subjects in the eyes of IFE.
And when you say we, that's not just us as an awarding organisation.
That's
do you
everyone.
mean everyone?
Yeah, so all awarding bodies. Now, the biggest question that everyone has had, and everyone keeps asking us, is, if you've got the alternatives to T-levels, like social care as an alternative to health is fine, but T-levels, I mean, the elephant in the room really is that T-levels have a high entry requirements. They're very difficult, and ultimately there's a reduced number of learners who are going to be able to do them. So what's the alternative for the learners that can't get onto a T-level, basically, is the question. So the difficulty there lies in the idea that you can't have overlap, so you can't make something that's basically covering the same ground as the T-level. Now, what we have found since the introduction of T-levels is that subjects that sit almost adjacent to a T-level have been doing really, really well since the T-levels have been introduced. So a good example of that is, since the business T-level has been introduced, travel and tourism numbers have shot up because of the reduction in the business T-level number and therefore the kind of alternative pathway it provides. So my answer to that, a bit of a waffle one here, would be the level 3 social care qualification that we're proposing to launch, because we're mapping it to a different standard. We are hoping to include in that additional content covering things like residential childcare and young people's care and things like that, and hoping that that will almost sit at the intersection of those two T-levels and offer an alternative pathway for learners who want to do something like that. I mean, in all honesty, like, do I wish that childcare and health and social care could stay funded and remain as the alternative? Yes, I do. I'm not going to, I shouldn't just come on this webinar and just give my own opinions, but I do think potentially we're making a mistake by not offering an alternative pathway. But my answer to that would be, that's probably the place, that social care qual is probably the place where we can direct learners who can't get to the education in early years T-level or the health T-level. That would be my closest approximation to a kind of parallel pathway.
Thank you.
But it's a contentious issue. I can't actually see the question written anywhere, but it's an absolutely contentious issue that should there be a parallel offering to all the T-levels? Potentially, yes, but it's out of our hands, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks.
Level 2 is actually much more straightforward, because level 2 only has two things, TOCs and what I called progs earlier. Now, TOCs are they are, as described before, there are far fewer things at level 2 to map against. So there's not many standards that we can actually do any mapping with. So it's not as easy to create, a full raft of TOCs. But progression qualifications exist as a kind of like level 2 stepping stone to progress learners onto level 3. T-level foundation programs are an example of one of these things, but they're kind of a bit of a wider net than that. So the definition of progression qualifications moving forward is they've got to be broad. They've got to allow kind of progression onto level 3 qualifications. And what that means really is, if we've got a level 3 qualification planned, travel and tourism, public services, for example, we are allowed to make a progression qualification as a kind of stepping stone onto that. And you can see that 240 GLH is kind of what we're looking at there, whereas T-level foundation specifically is a little bit smaller. That's just the qualifications that cover the national technical outcomes. Again, what do we have in that space? Well, you can see in all 5 areas, we anticipate having a level 2 program that progresses onto the level 3 program. And this will be the same across other awarding bodies and other sectors as well. So we'll be looking to make sure we've got level 2 progression available for all of those. And then where there is a level 2 standard that we can work with, we're also making a TOC as well. So you'll notice that early years practitioner, level 2 early years practitioner will still remain as it always did. That's a fairly standard qualification. And again, in health and social care, level 2 health and social care, as it was, won't exist, but there's healthcare support that we can map to, as well as adult care as well. That adult care is going to be almost identical to the care cert. So again, there are technical options and there are progressive options, and those progression options are kind of what we anticipate being the kind of major players at level 2, with obviously the things like license to practice here with early years being an important one as well. And it just remains to finish, really, I suppose, because I want to leave a little bit of time for further questions. It's just thinking about what that translates to in those sectors. So health and social care is a bit of a mishmash, I suppose. But you can see we've got the T level in health and the level 3, what would be extended diploma in social care. I didn't write the word extended on there because it didn't fit in the box. But we're going to have a health and a social care option at level 3. And at level 2, we've got a kind of, the potential for level 2 T-level transition, but also those technical programs in healthcare support and in adult care as well. So all of those things will slot in. Education in early years, I suppose, a little bit more straightforward. You've got your T-level there for education in early years, and then there'll be the T-level transition program, but also the level 2 early years practitioner. Again, that'll be very important because, of course, the T-level transition doesn't give you license to practice. So that level 2 diploma is also very important as well. So both of those things are going to be, key aspects of what's going to be coming in the future. And then it gets, if anything, quite a lot more simple when you get outside of what you'd call the cash sectors. So travel and tourism, we anticipate having a level 2 qualification that will lead on to potentially either of those level 3 pathways, travel or aviation. Sport, similar, we anticipate having one sport qualification at level 2 that could lead on to an academic sport and exercise science pathway or a technical sports coaching pathway, ideally. And uniform protective services, that the most straightforward one of all, a level 2 cert going on to a level 2 diploma. And again, just hopefully keeping things not a million miles from where they are now. Now, that was 5 sectors that we're doing. It's always very important if you go across the board and look at the other awarding bodies, they will be doing similar things in their key sectors. So if you spoke to City and Guilds, for example, you'd hear the same sort of thing, but about electrical installation and plumbing and engineering and manufacturing and so on. And all the other AOs would do something similar too. So we're ensuring we've got continuity of provision in our sectors. But again, hopefully the other awarding bodies will be kind of covering their sectors as well. So I think I've kind of waffled on long enough there, I suppose. It's really difficult to summarize this stuff without really getting bogged down in the jargon. But the really important thing, I suppose, and I'll go back to the slide, which I think is probably the most important one, which is this one, is that you can read and read and read about this stuff, but ultimately there's A levels, there's T levels, but there are alternatives in the TOC space and there are alternatives in the AAQ space. And our intention is to ensure that everything that we do is covered by a T level, a TOC, or an AAQ, and that's what all other awarding bodies are doing as well. And I believe after that final slide, there should have been I think that was the last slide. Yes, there should be a QR code, which will lead you to a feedback form about the session today, as well as the opportunity to apply for a digital credential. I think that's right, Charmaine, isn't it? I don't want to.
Yeah. So we everybody who attends, and only the attendees, so those who register and get the slides and recording after, will not unfortunately be able to get a digital credential, but everybody who's attended is eligible for a digital credential. But because we have to use a digital credential provider, Learning Vault, we have to have your express permission to share your name and your email address with Learning Vault for that sole purpose. That's the only purpose it's shared, and then you'll get sent your digital badge.
Lovely. So I think with that, I can't see the chat, but I think I will pause and ask if anyone's got any questions. I assume people might be frying people's brains slightly, but yes, and I believe people can, if you want to, put your hand up and ask the questions out loud as well. That also works too.
Yeah, so the only question that came through in the chat was the one that I read out before, and Helen responded to what you'd said, to just say, it's extremely disappointing, and I agree, a huge mistake. The health route is not an appropriate alternative. Oh, a new message has come through. It just says thank you. So if anybody has got any further questions, pop them in the chat. You can contribute verbally. If you'd prefer, I can stop the recording so that it's a bit of a more free and open space. Because people may not want to be on the recording. Oh, someone's got their hand up. Caitlin.
Hiya, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I've just popped a question in the Q&A. I don't think it's something you guys can answer, but I'm confused, I guess, in that I thought this process was meant to be simplifying post-16 qualifications, and it feels like it's getting more complicated.
Yes, I've heard that a lot. So the DFE make a big point of saying what we're going to create a simpler skills system. Now, what it certainly has done is, it's particularly in sectors that have got T levels, where you're splitting between a T level and a TOC and so on. It has created something quite complicated. The place where it's probably getting simpler is adult education, where there's lots and lots of kind of strange small quals that are getting defunded and they're trying to replace them. But I absolutely agree with you. If you get under the skin of TOCs, for example, and you look at some of the wording of some of the categories, they sound almost incomprehensible. So for me, the real key thing from an end user perspective is that when I talked about the TOCs, I'll go back to that slide about TOCs, which was quite a way back, wasn't it? But it was there. All this stuff about aligning to knowledge, skills, and behaviours, occupational standards. From an end user perspective, you don't see any of that stuff. What you see at the end of it all is, let's say for example, you were a travel and tourism teacher, you would just see NCFE, extended diploma in travel and tourism, and it wouldn't look particularly different to you. I think the obsession with splitting it into academic and technical is a little bit of an odd one. I think actually, for my money, the thing which is confusing people is the large AAQs, because AAQs are just extended certificates, right? So if you did an extended certificate and you studied it alongside A levels, people do that now. That's not particularly weird. And extended diplomas in areas where there's no T levels also exist now, so not particularly weird. I think it's the large AAQs as a sort of separate thing to large TOCs is what's a bit strange in people's minds. And a final thing to note on that as well is that I think we've had this discussion a lot with the DFE, is that I think trying to create two binary choices of going to HE or going into a job doesn't quite stack up. I mean, we all know that qualifications at level 3 have to be all things to all people, right? You've got people who want to get jobs, you've got people that want to get UCAS points and go to university, and that's been one of the considerations we've been doing when we've been making these things. We're saying, let's not make it a kind of binary choice. Let's try and make these things cover all bases. So I'd agree with you. Splitting the landscape in two, I think, is a little bit unhelpful. I don't know why they sort of felt the need to do that. It's not for us to do too many political comments, but there's a lot of big argument for if it wasn't broken, why did we need to fix it? But yeah.
I guess my difficulty is, so we deliver the T level in lab science, which is great. We've got students who do want to go down the academic route, but as you mentioned, don't have the grades for the T level either. So we have a number of students at the moment on our level 3 with grade 4s who our college wouldn't let onto A levels either. So we've then got, how can they get into science?
And that's the level 3 applied science. Is it a BTEC?
Yeah, so we can obviously introduce the AAQs, which is great, by other exam boards, but we don't have, they have to study at an A level or 2 alongside that, and they don't have the entry requirements for them. So
yeah, there are several subjects, particularly that we not necessarily that we work in, that have that the thing that people used to deliver is then being replaced by an AAQ, and the needing to mix that with A levels is quite scary. Social sciences is another example of that, where things like criminology, people aren't quite sure what the future of that lies. And actually, uniform public services is a brilliant example. Imagine if you teach level 3 uniform public services and someone says to you, oh, well, your new thing is you're going to have to do 2 A levels and an AAQ in public services. I think everyone's going to turn around and say,
that was what it was until these talks.
Yeah, and I think everyone was going, well, no chance. And the other thing is, of course, many general FE colleges just don't offer A levels and aren't set up to do so, which is why I think it's important. I mean, it's not in the documentation anyway, but I think it's very important to kind of make it clear that AAQs really are a school, sixth form, college type thing, and TOCs are a really general FE thing. I don't really anticipate many of these TOCs seeing like massive usage in schools, for example, but just because the nature of the way they are. And I don't expect many general FE colleges to suddenly pick up A levels overnight. People tend to just do what they've always done. So yeah, there are subjects like that where previously you used to be able to run a sort of certificate in applied science or a certificate in health and social care, and that's where the gap is. And I actually think a more general point would be that there's a type of learner here who maybe are going to fall through the gaps a little bit, are the learners who do a 1-year level 2 program and then aren't really that keen to sign up to 2 more years of level 3. They want to do something small over 1 year at level 3. That, I think, is a gap in the system. And it's something that potentially a new government would look to think about, because we don't know what a new government would do, but there have been comments about A, pausing the defunding, and B, just taking another look at the reforms was kind of the language they used. So we don't necessarily know if everything that we've submitted is going to exist in this form moving forward. So who knows? Things could change.
Thank you.
Quick one from the chat. It's possible, I think it's from somebody who's arrived a little bit later.
No problem.
Could you just remind us, what is a TOC?
So if I go back to this slide, TOC is technical occupational qualification, and AAQ is alternative academic qualification. And AAQs, by and large, are small, mixed in with A levels, academic qualifications, whereas TOCs are large technical qualifications that are mapped to apprenticeship standards. And the best way of thinking about them is they're a little bit like T levels where there's no T level. So if you teach a subject that's technical, but it hasn't got a T level, and you want to know what you're going to get in future, the answer is probably a large TOC. And in some ways, you could say that T levels are a very small subset of TOCs. They themselves are a technical occupational qualification. It's just that they were kind of brought forward ahead of time because they were in key kind of like growth sectors in the economy, whereas there's an argument for what about all those other sectors, but things like travel and tourism, there's no T level, so there will be a TOC instead. Whereas AAQs are not necessarily going to fill that gap, and that sort of that slide there sort of compares the two.
Perfect, and they've said thank you in the chat. And
No
there is it's not so much as a question, but just in terms of unless it's been. So you mentioned the replacement of residential childcare. Oh yeah, you did. And this it says we provide level 3 and level 5 diplomas in residential childcare, and I'm really concerned about TOCs.
Right, residential childcare. So residential childcare is an interesting one because level 5 is unaffected. The level 5, because the level 5 and the level 3 residential childcare sit as mandated quals in the apprenticeship standards. So there's a level 5 health and social care standard, which has kind of two prongs to it, and there's a level 4 one as well, and one of those is linked to kind of residential childcare. Now, the qualifications as they stand in the apprenticeships are unaffected by the reform. So level 3 diploma in residential childcare and the level, I can't remember what level 5's called, but it's got a much longer title. And those two qualifications are still going to exist, fundable through the apprenticeship funding stream. They just won't be fundable as standalone 16 to 19 programs outside of an apprenticeship. So, and the problem with level 3 residential childcare is it sits at a really strange place, because level 3 residential childcare is the mandated qual in a level 4 apprenticeship standard, not a level 3 one. So that means there's no level 3 occupational standard to map against. So that means we can't get level 3 residential childcare funded as a 16 to 19 program per se. Level 5 still unaffected, because that'll just be funded through the LLE. So with that level 3, yes, that qualification isn't going anywhere. It can be run as full cost. It can be run in the apprenticeship, no problem whatsoever. But for a funded 16 to 19 study program, we are attempting to make this level 3 social care TOC, which is nominally mapped to the adult care standard, but is going to include this additional content. We're trying to make sure we get some residential childcare in there as well, to make it a more of a broad sort of catch-all qualification for all of those things. It is a concern. I think that residential childcare has always been an anomaly on the landscape because of the fact it's level 3 but mapping into level 4, and so therefore it kind of sits in a strange place in these reforms. And it's also, an important thing. I didn't mention this at the start, but this only affects funding in England. So all of the qualifications that are being defunded, so your child cares, your health and social cares, and so on, those qualifications are not being withdrawn. I can't speak for every other awarding body, but NCFE are not getting rid of any of that, because those qualifications will still be used in Wales, in Northern Ireland, in the Isle of Man, Jersey, and all these places that don't sit within England will still use them. So if there was to be an extension to the funding, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Those things will still exist. And the same is true of residential childcare. Residential childcare will still be fundable outside of England. So if the funding rules change, if it was, for example, to be reinstated, we're not getting rid of it, because it still exists in apprenticeships. It still exists outside of England. So yeah, a long answer, but residential childcare is a confusing one because of the fact it sits in that level 4 apprenticeship standard and is not mapped to a level 3 occupational standard. So it can't go through the reforms in the same way the other ones do. Which I promised there would be a jargon-free session. I went very jargon heavy there. Apologies.
Thank you. And I'll read again because I know you can't see the chat. So how can those at the forefront of delivery get their voices heard in relation to the education early years, T-level content and the assessment processes? So for those who, is it too late if all the consultation has taken place, or is there a way that anybody who, needs to have a voice can have a voice?
So are we talking about the ways in which literally the way in which the T-level is delivered and assessed, as opposed to, because I think I'm going to go out a limb here. I think what this question's getting at is that I suppose an issue with T-levels often is the scalability, because the assessment methods are very resource heavy and quite complicated to deliver. So that whilst T-level is delivered by NCFE, the content and the kind of ways and the way in which it's structured is sort of owned by IFATE. It's owned by the government, basically. And we don't know what's going to happen if the government changes. Potentially they could reform T-levels, who knows? But I think from a delivery perspective, NCFE and all other awarding bodies who have T-levels have to deliver the T-levels kind of as mandated by the contracts that are handed out by the government. In terms of the best way to have voices heard, I mean, things like the Association of Colleges are the people who are the best, I would say, at kind of getting the voices of colleges heard amongst policy leaders. That's probably the best thing to do. But again, in terms of, I think, like I said, I think the question was getting at how you assess that the education in early years T-level. Is there a potential for that to be reformed so it becomes less resource intensive and less sort of complex an assessment methodology? That could potentially happen with a new government. We just don't know yet. Who knows?
And I think it was Helen who asked, who said yes, that is what they meant. So your interpretation of the question is what they. Somebody's just clarifying. Did you say that funding for STLS/EY? I don't know if I'm guessing that's early years is going.
So that's childcare and supporting teaching and learning level 3.
Okay.
So this August, so that means next September, as it currently stands, new learners can't be enrolled on it. So learners who are already enrolled can finish. They can still carry on if they're already on program. But this September, level 3 childcare, level 3 supporting teaching and learning are no longer funded for 16 to 19-year-olds. Adults are still funded, and that's important to point out. So AEB funding remains, but they're just pulling the 16 to 19 funding for this September. And as I said, that is how it stands at this exact moment in time. But in a few days' time, there could be some political upheaval. We don't know. It may be extended, but that's how it is right now. That's the policy situation now.
Thank you.
Yeah, everyone, thank you so much for giving up your time, particularly because it's probably the summer holidays now for most people. I hope it was illuminating, and I hope it was, as I said, as jargon-free as possible. An important thing to note is on our website, we've got several kind of forms that you can fill in to get more detailed information about this. And I am happy to be contacted by anybody for kind of a consultation outside of this, because we're very keen to get into centres and really help them understand this process and plan out their new curriculum. So I hope that was really helpful, and any further advice or guidance anyone needs, please don't hesitate to get in contact. And thank you so much for coming, everybody. Goodbye.